So I recently reviewed the original Space Jam to see how it holds up by today's standards, and needless to say, it really hasn't aged well with time. The acting was terrible, the story structure was choppy, the tunes were badly written, and it was way too on the nose about being a 90-minute commercial. But I do give it credit that it has some semblance of just trying to have fun with how much of a product of the time it is. It also had some uniqueness in its concept of crossing over iconic cartoon characters with famous celebrities at the time. This, combined with a few other things, allows the movie to stand as a cult classic. It's a corny movie you can enjoy ironically and just have fun with how dumb it is. But of course, with its popularity among fans, Hollywood would inevitably make a sequel for the movie years later. Space Jam: A New Legacy, starring LeBron James. When I first heard about this, I was a bit on the fence about the idea. With how much of a corporate cash grab the first film was, and seeing as how they were trying to combine every Warner Brothers property into one movie, I was getting flashbacks of how embarrassing the original was. But on the other hand, I recognized its potential to be better. A lot has changed in the last 25 years with our understanding of story and character that can be used to improve upon the original. This sequel could have had everything the first film didn't. Better story, better pacing, better characters, better portrayal of the Looney Tunes, and it could at least make an effort to focus less on being a product and more like a movie with a 3-act structure. And then my hopes started to dwindle away little by little. As more and more trailers started coming out, the movie just started to look way more gimmicky. Okay, so they're gonna travel to all these different worlds that are just there to remind you that it's a Warner Brothers movie and make no attempt to hide its corporate shilling. But due to my checkered relationship with the original, I'll admit my curiosity got the better of me as I waited for the movie to premiere, expecting the worst but hoping for something at least watchable. And then the movie premiered.
What up? It's Porky Pig. They call me P-double-L-G. Step to me, he don't want no trouble.
My eyes! The pain!
Yeah, you can see where this is going. Alright, so I'm gonna try and be fair here and try to start by talking about the few things in the movie that work. Firstly, the story structure is a huge improvement over the original. There's a better sense of focus on the primary plot points, which results in the movie feeling less rushed. And that's probably due to how there's less subplots this time. Unlike the original that had a whole bunch of different plots, this one only seems to have two. James teaming up with the Toons for basketball, and James trying to save his son from the villain. The way it cuts between different plot points also feels less intrusive. Like, this feels like a good time to cut to the other characters to see what they're up to. Unlike the original that was constantly cutting between all sorts of different things in a disjointed manner. And unlike the original where they get to the basketball game in the last 30 minutes, this movie gets to the game roughly halfway through. So the showdown between the Toons and the villain feels less rushed. The next positive to this movie is how the Looney Tunes are portrayed a lot better. For the most part. The original had a huge problem with the way it portrayed them, modernizing them while stripping away their zaniness to draw more attention to the athletes. This movie doesn't do that except for that one very obvious moment, and it's a very welcome improvement. The way the Looney Tunes are characterized here is much more faithful to the original source material. The personalities, the wacky antics, the charm, and the chemistry between them make for the best parts of the movie. While it's not on par with the original cartoons, it does have a far better understanding of what makes the Looney Tunes fun to watch. Unlike the original that just treated them like background characters and a marketing stunt. I also have to give credit that making LeBron James into a fully animated character was a very smart move. The original movie didn't animate Michael Jordan, which forced them to rely on his acting skills. But because Michael Jordan was such a bad actor, his interactions with the Looney Tunes were very unconvincing and constantly dragged you out of the experience. Here, they don't have to worry about that problem. The way the animators get him to work off the tunes is honestly pretty well done. His character actually interacts and reacts to all the crazy stuff that happens to him instead of just standing around doing nothing. It's vibrant, immersive, fluid, and a lot more immersive than if they just had James interacting with a bunch of green screen effects. You know, before they just have him interact with a bunch of green screen effects. Even Lola Bunny is written better. Unlike the original where she was just objectified and acting sexy, in this movie she feels more like a Looney Tunes character. She makes an appearance in the Wonder Woman world and she's shown to have an actual personality. She's expressive, short-tempered, determined, headstrong. And her interactions with Bugs are more genuine and not just forcing a generic romance between them. So yeah, this movie actually has some good stuff in it. The story structure is better, the Looney Tunes are better written, the 2D animation is very well crafted, and the interactions between the Toon characters and James is a lot more convincing than what the original did with Michael Jordan. And unfortunately, it's all downhill from there. I think you guys are already familiar with the most obvious problem with the movie, so let's save that for later and try to focus on other things. For starters, it's extremely predictable and cliché. It's just the usual story about the underdogs going against the big leagues, and they don't do anything interesting or all that different. The way they go about it just feels very formulaic and cluttered. One of the more cluttered parts of the movie is definitely the montage of James and Bugs traveling to all these different Warner Brother worlds to gather the Looney Tune characters. The problem with this montage is that it's really boring and clearly in the movie for no other reason than to shove a bunch of Warner Brother properties in your face. I mean, why exactly did we have to travel to all of these worlds just for the sake of it? It's so painfully obvious that it's here just because Warner Brothers wants to have a montage of popular franchises they own. Were they trying to do the same thing Kingdom Hearts did? Because if that's what they were going for, they didn't do a good job. In the original Kingdom Hearts, the Disney worlds had a purpose. The plot was Sora traveling to different worlds in search of keyholes and sealing them to hold off the Heartless invasion. And the time they spent in each world developed the story and Sora's character arc as he went in search for his missing friends. Not only that, but it also developed Riku's character, showing how he became more and more desperate to save Kairi and was willing to rely on darkness that caused his bitterness towards Sora to drive them apart. This movie doesn't have that sense of purpose. Traveling to all these different worlds doesn't have an effect on the story or the characters. It just amounts to a brief montage of James and Bugs tracking down the tunes. It's really hollow and void of any real excitement. Another weak point of the movie is definitely the acting. You know how Michael Jordan was a terrible actor in the original? Well, LeBron James isn't much better. His acting is very wooden and extremely stale, and it feels like he's only got 2 facial expressions throughout the whole movie. And the 2D animated segments, while well crafted, still have to work off of James' voice acting skills. And needless to say, he's not a good voice actor either. He constantly struggles to have the right emotion, and a lot of his inflections just come across as forced. Much like MJ, he's a better basketball player than an actor, and his son doesn't do much better either. Every time he's on screen, it always feels like he's just phoning it in, and he barely puts any expression into his dialogue. But perhaps they can work around how bad the acting is if the story is good, right? Well, it's not. The subplot with James and his son having a hard time connecting is extremely rushed and not given nearly enough time to properly develop. Obviously, they wanted to make the movie more character-focused, but the character they go for is extremely forced. In the original, Michael Jordan was presented as an everyman. It was one of the few things in the original Space Jam that worked because of how believable his character was. He was grounded and down to earth, and the movie focuses on his life after retirement from basketball, spending quality time with his family and exploring new interests. They didn't need to come up with this phoned-in subplot about him being an overbearing parent. The way they try to establish the conflict between James and his son is very poor and not at all believable. And when you get down to it, it doesn't even make any sense. Why would LeBron James want his kids to be basketball players like him? Why wouldn't he want them to pursue different interests? Does he think of basketball as a family tradition that needs to be upheld? There's little to no chemistry between James and his son throughout the whole movie, to the point that there's no reason to feel invested in it. And by the time they get to the scene where James says he's sorry and his son forgives him and they share a big hug and everyone in the crowd cheers for them, you just don't care. It's supposed to be this really emotional moment, but there was no proper build-up to it, and it feels like the movie is just trying way too hard. And while I praise the 2D animation for its more traditional feel, the 3D CGI is terrible. The character designs of the tunes are really distracting, and several of the models just look really crooked and too bulgy. They're trying to make them look more realistic and rounded, which only takes away from the zaniness they're supposed to have. I remember watching these CGI shorts with Daffy Duck in the opera, Wile E. Coyote chasing the Roadrunner, Tweety singing a song while Sylvester is trying to catch him, and the CGI in those shorts were actually really good. They were bright, colorful, expressive, and the style they use captures the zaniness a lot better, so there's no reason this movie couldn't replicate this properly. And to add insult to injury, you remember the aliens from the original Space Jam? Well, they make an appearance, through recycled stock footage. I'm not kidding. They literally just take shots of them from the first movie and splice them on screen in the laziest Photoshop job possible. And it's so painfully obvious that they couldn't be bothered to spend just a little more money to actually animate them into the movie that it comes across as cringe-inducing. And it might not have been so bad if it wasn't for the fact that they do this twice. They seriously had to do it twice in case you didn't get it the first time that they were too cheap to actually animate them. For a movie that clearly has the budget as big as this movie has, there is no excuse for this kind of laziness. Oh, and they actually had the nerve to tease us with a possible cameo from the actual Michael Jordan just to show that it was Michael B. Jordan instead. The one thing that a lot of fans of the original were looking forward to, and you couldn't even give us that. Even knowing they weren't actually going to get MJ for this movie, it still feels really scummy that they deliberately got people's hopes up for the sake of a half-assed joke. Oh, and did I mention there's a lot of cringe-inducing content in this movie? The forced memes, the forced pop culture references, the fact they made James do that stupid dab, the fact they made Granny say haters gonna hate, and the fact they resorted to that stupid Matrix parody that got old years ago. It wasn't even original when Shrek did it. Yeah, it's a Warner Brothers property. That doesn't make it any less forced. The only way this could possibly get any more cringe-inducing is if they had a sequence of Porky Pig getting into a rap battle.
I'll end this with one bar, most famous of all quotes. This battle is now over. That's all, folks.
I hate this fucking timeline. I just hate it so much. There's also this really confusing plot point about how Bugs thinks of the Looney Tunes as family and how he feels alone and lost without them, but that's a really weird way to describe the Looney Tunes. How exactly are they family? Aren't they constantly trying to blow each other up or slapsticking each other for the fun of it? We never see any chemistry between the Tunes that makes you think they're family, so where did this come from? What, is this some sort of Fast and Furious reference? And if you thought that was embarrassing, they also have to throw in this really dramatic scene where Bugs sacrifices himself to win the game and it looks like he's going to be deleted. This could have worked if they were building up to some kind of joke. They could have done something like What's Opera Doc, where they satirized the dramatic buildup and reveal it was just a joke about operas having a sad ending. But no. Instead, they play this scene straight. They seriously play up the big dramatic music and the big dramatic dialogue with everyone looking sad like this is really it for Bugs Bunny, and they do the big dramatic shot as he says his last words, and do you really think that Warner Brothers would let him die? Even when they reveal he's alive 2 minutes later, they don't do it like it was part of the joke. They just did a cheap fake-out death that had no self-awareness for the sake of drama. And another confusing thing about this movie is how they try to act like it's a sequel, but they literally show a poster of the original Space Jam in the movie. It's right there with no attempt to hide it. They reference the original Space Jam multiple times like it was something that happened in universe, but then they show how the original Space Jam was just a product. If this is supposed to be a sequel, why is the original movie a product? How did the Looney Tune world get transported from the center of the Earth into cyberspace? How did the AI create the new Looney Tunes world? Did he abduct them and throw them into the computer? Do the Tunes not care they're suddenly in a computer? There's no logical consistency to this at all. And of course, I don't think I have to delve into that much when it comes to the bullshit they pulled with Pepe Le Pew. Oh sure, Pepe Le Pew was cut from the movie because some dipshits on Twitter said he influenced rape culture, but then they have the rapist from A Clockwork Orange appear in the movie. Hypocritical much? And I know you've all been waiting for me to talk about this, so let's talk about the biggest problem with the movie. It's a giant Warner Brothers circle jerk. If you hated the product placement in the original Space Jam, this movie will give you a fucking heart attack. Every second of this movie is constantly shoving shameless plugins to other Warner properties down your throat in a desperate tactic to sell you something. Oh, and it's not like they only feature a handful of their more iconic IPs as a clever nod. Oh no, they throw the entire goddamn library at you. Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, The Wizard of Oz, The Matrix, Casablanca, Scooby-Doo, The Jetsons, The Flintstones, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, The Justice League, The It reboot, The Animaniacs, Thundercats, Space Ghost, The Iron Giant, The Mask, King Kong, A Clockwork Orange, Mad Max, Austin Powers, Rick and Morty, the entire lineup of Hanna-Barbera cartoons, and many others that I don't have time to mention. Even for Space Jam, this movie is insultingly corporate. You can't go a single moment in this film without constantly being reminded you're watching a Warner Brothers movie. Hell, you can't even make the argument that they're self-aware because this movie has no self-awareness whatsoever. There's literally a scene where they make fun of uninspired corporate synergy bullshit and then immediately forget how that's a bad thing and proceed to flood the narrative with it. They make fun of how hiring sports athletes for your movie is a terrible idea and a cheap cash grab, and then spend the next 60 minutes force-feeding you how fucking awesome LeBron James is. Fuck, when James lands in the Toon World, they literally show you the Nike symbol where he lands. You seriously couldn't resist doing that for even a second? And I know, it looks like I'm making a big deal out of this, like I'm supposed to be surprised. I mean, the original Space Jam was shameless corporate garbage too, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it is here. This movie is somehow an even worse commercial than the original Space Jam. And I might have been willing to overlook this because it's Space Jam and I should have expected this to happen going into the movie, but it's because of how badly Warner Brothers is just jerking themselves off to this stuff. Every single second of this movie is Warner Brothers saying, hey folks, are you a fan of all these properties we're desperately trying to force into the movie? Then why not subscribe to HBO Max? Only $14.99 a month for the rest of your life. First one's free. The basketball game is definitely the worst of it, as your attention is constantly being distracted by all of the stupid Easter eggs they shoved into this film. It's extremely overcrowded and ugly to look at. You know the jokes that people have been making about this movie trying to be like Ready Player One when the trailer first came out? Yeah, that's exactly what it is. They wanted to be like Ready Player One, but didn't bother to hire Spielberg to consult how to incorporate a background universe of characters. They just looked at the concept they came up with and said, fuck it. Let's just throw a bunch of stuff on screen to get stupid people's attention because we're referencing all sorts of classic and popular IPs instead of creating something good. Because as bad writers, we're incapable of doing so. Easter eggs are supposed to be a small thing in the background you didn't notice during your first viewing. It's supposed to be a tiny clue you notice over time so you can congratulate yourself for finding it later. They're not supposed to be painfully obvious. They're not supposed to be all over the foreground for everyone to see. And they're not supposed to supersede the actual movie. It astounds me how Warner Brothers is so shameless and made no attempt to hide their corporate shilling in this film. Hell, they even got E3 involved in this mess. How much money do you think E3 was willing to pay to make an appearance in a fucking Space Jam movie? Do you have no humility? Do you have no shame? Do you have any idea how to make a movie without shoving product placement in our faces? What in God's name is wrong with you?
Ow! Keep it together, man!
This movie is a giant mess. It's objectively bad in so many ways. There was a part of me that knew it was going to be underwhelming going in, but I didn't think it was going to be this bad. In spite of the movie's positives, it's just a huge disaster that doesn't have any sort of lasting power. The acting is subpar, the story is very forgettable, the jokes are forced, and the cringe-inducing memes overpowered the whole point of the film. They clearly didn't care about writing a cohesive film and just wanted to pack in as many worthless references as possible in place of any actual content. I mean, when people look back on this film months later, what do you think they're actually going to talk about? The story? The acting? The characters? No. All they're gonna talk about is the crossover elements and how it's trying to be like Player One and the constant plugins to Warner Brothers properties. And this movie has no excuse for being such a big mess. It had 25 years to improve upon the flaws of the original. There was loads of potential to make an actual movie instead of just a shameless cash grab. And what did they do? They made the movie a shameless cash grab. And that just makes this movie even more of a cash grab than the original because of that potential being squandered and how badly they just didn't give a shit. This film reminds me of that Scoob movie that came out last year, where it desperately tries to nostalgia bait people while trying to modernize itself to a fault. It just feels pointless. The movie doesn't do anything to elevate the elements of the original, and even when they do something right, they end up doing something to screw it up. Streamlining a capital S product onto the big screen to get people to pay money to watch said capital S product on the big screen has been done with much better success with far more engaging movies. So this movie had no excuse for not bothering to put that same effort into making something engaging. On a surface level, I do like the idea of a cyberspace having all these different Warner Brothers properties and combining them into their own universe, but it's not fleshed out enough, and it just makes the whole movie look like a shameless product placement. It's not even a Looney Tunes movie. It's a Warner Brothers movie and a LeBron James movie that happens to have the Looney Tunes in it. Space Jam: A New Legacy could have been good, at least by Space Jam standards, but instead they just decided to make the movie into a giant commercial, again, and that's not what we want. We want actual movies with an actual story and actually engaging cast, with something of actual value that'll bring us back to it years later. We don't want shameless corporate garbage. We want quality. I only saw this movie out of curiosity because I was already subscribed to HBO Max beforehand. If my only option was watching this movie in theaters, I wouldn't have paid a single cent to see it, because it wouldn't be worth it. I guess if you already have HBO Max, you could see it out of curiosity. But if not, then it's really not worth it. There's all sorts of better and a lot less shameless movies you could be watching instead. And now, I'm just gonna go watch something of actual substance. Until then, thanks for watching and stay cool. Thanks for checking out my review. If you liked what you saw here, feel free to check out my Patreon in the description. Every little bit helps and I appreciate people who show their support for me. I'll be working on more stuff in the coming weeks after taking a small break. Until next time, stay tuned.